once again, thanks to all the presenters and thanks to all the those who have come to join in this conversation. So over to you, Claudine.
Thank you very much for that, Marjorie. I'd like to begin by thanking you for organizing this panel today, and also to thank Dr. Ricketts for those very thoughtful words. The reminder of both Ubuntu and Imsit Nogowa was really, I think, important for us to have today. And since Dr. Ricketts pointed out his background, I think I'll share with you my background today. For those of you who don't recognize the photograph, is Ruby Bridges' first day in integrating her school, all the way back before I was born. But we're still fighting the same struggles today in certain ways. And I thought this image was perfect for the conversation I'd like to have today, because on a panel that's dedicated to discussions of race and ethics in the academy, I was perhaps expected to talk about how race is and has been understood within my particular disciplinary boundaries. But what I'd like to talk about instead is the place or the role of the social sciences, and in particular sociology in Black life. Since 2019, we've become all too aware of incidents at various universities across the country. I myself was present with our former student, Shelby McPhee, when he was racially profiled and made to feel uncomfortable on the campus at UBC. And the incidents that students have had to experience, these incidents that these students have had to experience, have led to more and more discussion of the role of the disciplines in dismantling institutional barriers, including a series of papers that were published in the Canadian Review of Sociology in August 2020. Some of those papers I will actually refer to in this talk. So I'd like to begin by saying that I understand sociology as a prevalently white and masculine form of knowledge. This form of knowledge emerged as a response to the transition to the industrial age and to a bourgeois society in Europe. But as undergrads in our first few months in Intro to Soc, we traditionally meet the founding fathers, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, and the question always arises, who else's perspective makes it into this canon? And of course, the answer to this question tends to be informed by political and ideological perspectives that reflect power dynamics at given moments in history. Many social scientists at the end of the 19th century maintained racist attitudes and worked racist myths and stereotypes into their explanations of the social world. Under the guise of value-free and universal knowledge production, racism was legitimated by dominant scientific discourses, things like social Darwinism, a perspective that sought to apply the concept of natural selection to the social world in order to account for why some groups, be they racial or class groupings, did better than others. And we can see examples of the ways this kind of thinking pervaded the academy, including sociology, when we look at things like early editions of journals such as the American Journal of Sociology that published articles advocating sterilization of so-called degenerates, offering glowing endorsements of the effects of slavery on the well-being of Black people, and endorsing the social theory of genetics. During this period, few scholars studied race or racism. There was no room in the discipline to examine the experiences of racialized people. But a saying that I like, necessity is the mother of invention. What we can call Black sociology is a disciplinary practice that came out of challenges and critique of the logic of social inquiry inside the academy, dating back to the early years of the 20th century and well before. And scholars like W.B. Du Bois created their own sociological epistemology premised on the exploration and theorization of the lived experiences of people of African descent. The existence and personal lived experiences of systemic racism actually led Black sociologists to do this work for the Black community. And according to Brooks and Wright, in facing institutional forces that were hostile or apathetic, Black scholars created their own means for studying themselves. Black sociology addressed cultural codes that represented Black people in very stereotypical and often distasteful ways, referring to Blacks as lazy or immoral or unclean or uneducated, rude and thoughtless. And what Black sociologists worked to do was to counteract these limited observations and wild gossip with empirical data. There were Black scholars such as Anna Julia Cooper, who had developed a framework to analyze the connections between racialized sexism and sexualized racism through her own intersectional experiences as a Black woman coming of age in the South during Reconstruction and Jim Crow. Also, Du Bois, who I've mentioned, and Franklin Frazier were creating innovative theories and methods relevant to their social world, but their scholarship remained excluded from the intellectual ranks of their white colleagues. Now, of course, today the work of many of these and other Black sociologists have been integrated into the discipline, but there continue to be critiques directed at what Patricia Hill Collins has referred to as an outsider within status. According to American sociologist Orly Clerg, the state of the scholarship on Black communities continues to be hindered by the white normativity of the discipline and subjectivities of its dominant scholars. Black Canadian sociologists and other social scientists, I think, support this perspective, with University of Toronto Ronaldo Walcott even going so far as to call the discipline foundationally anti-Black in its logics and practices. For Walcott, there's no room for the Black scholar in this community. And interestingly, in my fourth year seminar, my students raised the same point, noting the ways that the discipline highlights a progressive scholarship of wokeness of social identities, but yet the queer, the Black, the Indigenous bodies lie outside or apart and positioned in the language of abstraction. Walcott refers to Black bodies here inside the academy as matter out of place, a reminder that 120 years after Du Bois, the academy is still trying to push us out. So I think a hard lesson to learn as a young scholar is that the university itself is one of the systemic, institutionalized, cultural, and individual sites of racism. It's a hard lesson at any time. But today, there are more scholars in the academy continuing in the tradition of creating innovative theories and methods relevant to the lived experiences of Black people. And since the killing of George Floyd and the global protests against anti-Black racism, we've seen a flurry of hires across the continent as institutions acknowledge their complicity in maintaining the systemic programs, policies, and practices that challenge equity. In the wake of the global pandemic, we saw scholars taking public health to task for its unwillingness to acknowledge race as a social determinant of health, even in the face of empirical data to the contrary. The pushback was all too familiar, couched in the language of an absence of objectivity on the part of the Black scholar in their claims of racism. So it's been heartening, I guess, to see small changes in policy and practice in a very short time. York University's Carl James suggests that an ethical sociology is one that goes beyond an awareness of systemic anti-Black racism and to being truly transformative, and hence anti-racist in its practice. He challenges the discipline by asking, what good are sociological studies or the expressed support of researchers if they are merely academic exercises that do nothing to change the material conditions of racialized people and Black people in particular? I agree, and I look to the future in hopes that the discipline can learn to be transformative instead of being complicit in the destruction of Black life. For Walcott, there is no redemption. Sociology must die if Black people and Black thought are to live and flourish on their own terms. Thank you.
It's our pleasure to sit for a conversation with Associate Professor Dr. Claudine Bonner. Claudine now culminates 10 years' work at Acadia University as the inaugural Vice Provost, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. She has a number of research and teaching interests that include Black Canadian history, migration and diaspora, gender equity, and education. Claudine was born in Jamaica and is now in Canada. Welcome, Claudine. It's been great working with you and wonderful to make this time to have this conversation. So I invite you to please share with us some aspects of your journey. Can you share with us some of the religious aspects that emerged from your research?
Okay. Thanks for having me, by the way. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about my research at the end of this period of time that I've been at Acadia. This question gave me pause because I haven't really thought a lot about the religiosity of some of the work I've done. But when I think about it, of course, if I'm doing work on the African diaspora, if I'm thinking about Blackness in general, it's almost impossible to divorce it or separate it from the church, from spirituality, from religion. And some of the work I've done, starting with the things closer to Acadia, in my first 2 years here, we did a project that looked at emerging themes in African diaspora history, African Nova Scotian history. And a lot of the work I personally was involved in looked at the No. 2 Construction Battalion. And the No. 2 Construction Battalion was an all-Black unit that came out of Nova Scotia, was based in Nova Scotia, had soldiers of African descent from all over the region, from within North America and the Caribbean. And the most senior officer was Reverend William White, who was the second Black graduate from Acadia. And so he was the chaplain of the battalion. And so with learning about Reverend White's relationship to Acadia, to the No. 2 Construction Battalion, it kind of took me on a journey of looking at the relationship of the African Baptist Church with the larger African Nova Scotian community. So that's kind of one thing that was unexpected going into the project, but I've spent a lot of time looking at his time at Cornwallis Baptist Church, looking at his time overseas with the battalion, looking at his time at Acadia, trying to find out about his religious awakenings and teachings while he was in the US. He actually came to Canada from Virginia. And so what could we learn about his experiences in the seminary before he came here, and so on and so forth. That's perhaps the most direct religious aspect of the research I've done since I've been here. I've also done a lot of work around Caribbean migration and other diasporic migrations within the Nova Scotia region and the East Coast in general. And through that have thought about, learned about the different kinds of relationships that people of African descent have with the church, with religion, with their own personal spirituality. In particular, I recently have been focused on Whitney Pier, which is in Cape Breton. And the Whitney Pier community has a large Caribbean component. The majority of those people came from Barbados, but also other islands in the Caribbean. And when they arrived in the pier, they mostly worshiped at different churches throughout. They went to predominantly white churches. Some of these churches formed smaller spaces for worship. So they I'm trying to nicely talk about segregation during this period, but this is the early 1910s, 1920s, and so some of the parishioners weren't comfortable with these Caribbean folk coming in, so they had smaller spaces for them to worship. And one of the things that I found early in the research is how much the people looked for something to call their own. So they started worshiping in borrowed spaces. They had men's fraternal organizations that had spaces in town. They would have service on Sunday. There was the AME Zion Church. I'm not sure if it was a Zion or just an AME church. We're still trying to figure out where it was and when it was, but that was in Sydney. They also had, the only African Orthodox church in Canada, which came out of the Garvey movement, the relationship between the Garvey movement at the time and the Caribbean migrants who settled in Whitney Pier somehow led to the formation of an African Orthodox church, which is still in Whitney Pier. It's today it's a very small church, but every community elder I've spoken to talks about the reality that regardless of what church was their home church, they always had a relationship with the African Orthodox Church. That was so. There's a notion of church having playing different roles in people's lives, and so one could be in the church choir at this church. Where you go is your family church over here. You're a deacon in another church, but you're somehow having a relationship with each of these churches in different ways. And so that's what I found in Whitney Pier to be true. So people might go to the Anglican church, but they're still members of the African Orthodox Church. With the religiosity, there's the relationship to music and community and history and all those things.
Did you notice anything in terms of the women? Because often in churches, the leadership is the men. They are the ones who are quoted. But did you pick up anything in terms of the role of the women in the churches, in the communities, maybe even in the valley here?
Interestingly enough, so most of my research somehow has become very much about men. I think I have somehow in the last few years become more of a labor historian who looks at men going into spaces. But that the direction you just took me in kind of reminds me that in all of these spaces, when you look at the church, in terms of traditional care work, nurturing, organizing the church in terms of drives and community support, you could see the presence of the women in the community. Whitney Pier is kind of why I've started being a historian who looks at men and men's work, because it was essentially a frontier community. Right? It was a community that was built around coal mining and steel making. So it was about industry, and men came from all over the world to work in steel and in coal. But when the women came, they brought structure. The women brought order to these communities, and like it's a really kind of sociology of the family kind of way of thinking about things. But you see it if you think about the relationship, for example, to the Garvey movement. If you read the historic newspapers from the UNIA. They talk about, the women in the church sending letters to New York, talking about the need for, supports. The women doing pie socials, the women doing fundraising to help support families who were in need, and so on and so forth. So I saw that a lot. You asked about women of faith in the Valley. I haven't really done very much work with the Valley. I sit on the board of the Valley African Nova Scotian Development Agency. And that was started by a woman of faith in the Valley. So Geraldine Browning, who's a member of the Gibsons Wood Church and is a leader and has been a leader for the last 2-3 generations in the African Nova Scotian community. And I think she would argue, and we would be hard pressed to disagree with her, that the creation of the organization, the maintenance of the organization, everything about it comes from faith and responsibility for community coming out of that kind of set of beliefs.
Well, thank you. I want to shift, right back to Acadia and ask you, what are some of the highlights of your 10 years at Acadia University?
The highlights will always be the students. For me, the students are the most important things. The ability to have close relationships with students in ways that don't exist at larger schools. I did my undergraduate work at U of T, I did my master's at U of T, I did my PhD at Western, and all of those are large universities. So coming to Acadia, where we have a small population, under 4,000 students, it was an opportunity to really build relationships with students. And when I got here, I think I didn't anticipate the kinds of close relationships that I would develop with the students. There was a space for me to do work that wasn't being done on campus. So I was able to, introduce the campus to things like Martin Luther King Day, to do programming around Black History Month, to highlight student work in the community, to bring in people like Geraldine Browning, so they could be introduced to the broader Valley African Nova Scotian communities, to build community with historians and other scholars from the African Nova Scotian communities, and bring that into the university. So those are the things that I'm most proud of being able to do. And also having the difficult conversations in the classroom, right? Talking about, I started teaching courses like, social inequalities, social problems, race and ethnic relations, race and indigeneity in Canada, and all the things that nobody wants to talk about, right? And, but I hope that I found ways to open up those conversations on campus and make them approachable. Even, they're not any less difficult, they're always going to be difficult conversations, but to allow students to recognize that it's okay to have those difficult conversations. And it's important to have those difficult conversations. So seeing students being willing to initiate them, seeing students being willing to go deeper and say, okay, so we talked about this, and I went home and talked to my family about it, and I got pushback. And this is what I said, and just having those moments where students will say, we don't really talk about those things at home. But I'm so glad that we talked about it in your class. That is something that kept coming back over the time I was here, and it's something that makes me smile. It tells me that even in a small way, I've managed to get students to think about the world differently. And so for me, that's a highlight. That's something that's really important to me.
Were you the first Black woman to be hired as a lecturer at Acadia?
Yes, as far as I know, yes. In all my research, there were no others before me. So yes.
So there were many firsts.
Many firsts.
Not just the vice provost post.
No. I was the first woman hired. I was the only Black woman on campus until a year ago. Or 2 years ago. I'm forgetting when you were hired. Was it 2020? Okay.
March 2020.
There you go. Wow, how time flies. So before your arrival, I was the first Black woman on campus. Only Black woman.
The only Black woman on campus.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah. So what else would you see as some of your highlights at Acadia?
Highlights. I'm thinking about this. In 2014, I believe it was, I was part of the President's Decolonizing Council. And so at that time, Acadia was responding to the Truth and Reconciliation process. And we initiated a Decolonizing Council it was a very large group, but where we had some of the really difficult conversations around what does decolonizing look like at Acadia? What can we do? What have we done? What haven't we done? And we met for, it felt like a really long time. I think it was a year, but it felt like a very long time because of how difficult some of those conversations were. And it brought community in, from our neighboring Indigenous communities. The Mi'kmaq communities came into the campus, and we had real conversations. And from that, we developed a set of recommendations which have led to some real change on campus. We have an Indigenous advisor to the president. We have an Indigenous Advisory Council. Which meets regularly with, at Acadia and helps shape our approaches to curriculum, to everyday practice, to teachings and so on. It's a very slow process because, of course, culture change takes time. But that was one of my first big institutional changing moments at Acadia. I was also part of the process of developing the harassment and discrimination policy, the policy around sexual assault and violence on campus. And those, of course, were difficult conversations as well. So, but looking back on how Acadia has changed over the last 10 years, I think these are seminal moments. These are important moments in terms of looking at ourselves and asking ourselves some of the tough questions. Being part of the President's Anti-Racism Task Force, which you chaired, was also a major moment at this university where we were able to look at anti-Black racism and look at issues of race and indigeneity again and ask ourselves, what are we doing right and what aren't we, and how can we make change? Which, of course, then led to the creation of my position as Vice Provost, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, because it's part of the process of making the steps towards a more inclusive campus and a more inclusive university. So I think in terms of highlights, those things, I can say in the time I've been here, I can see tangible changes on this campus. And I think I've been not on the sidelines. I've been trying really hard to be a part of making change on this campus.
I'm glad you added the second part. I know, for example, that you and Mary Sweetman did a lot of work to get Black History Month on the calendar at Acadia. And I'm also curious about the Decade for People of African Descent, which draws to a close in 2024. So do you have any thoughts about the significance of the decade in light of the research you've done, in light of what's been happening at Acadia, and the fact that it's over in 2024?
Yeah, it's the decade that flew by. When I think back, 2014 to 2024, in terms of Blackness at Acadia, the reality is, of course, the decade got interrupted by COVID-19.
Yes.
So there's 3 years, a block of 3 years there where perhaps more could have been done that wasn't done. But we managed to, right now we will double the presence of Black faculty on campus. We've just completed our cluster hire. We'll have 3 new Black hires through the cluster, plus there will be 1 or 2 others through targeted hires. So the face of Acadia has changed.
Yeah.
In that time, we've also seen more students coming to us from the Caribbean. We have more students coming from Bermuda and Bahamas in particular. So again, the face of Acadia has changed in 2 ways. We are working to add more staff, Black and Indigenous and otherwise racialized. But thinking about the decade specifically and thinking about Blackness, I think it's the one thing that has changed more than anything else is the need for acknowledging the absences and correcting them. So I think we're more aware today as an institution of the ways we've systemically worked to keep people out.
Yeah.
Right? So I think prior to the decade, had someone said that, we might have faced more pushback than we do today. Today, there's an understanding at the institution that there needs to be a corrective to what our past was in terms of anti-Blackness.
That's good, because sometimes we see the absences, but to name the achievements is also really, really important. I probably want to shift it to some more personal dimensions now. So what would you say have been some of the themes and milestones of your personal journey? And as you are about to embark on a new phase at Mount Allison, what are your hopes for the future?
Okay. When I think about my personal journey, one of the things I realize is my work reflects my growing understanding and relationship with my Blackness. So I started my academic journey as a physiology student.
Wow.
My first undergraduate degree is in the sciences, and that came as a result of my parents being in the sciences. My parents are dentists. They did their university studies in the sciences, and so that's what you do. That was the expectation. And it wasn't until the end of my undergraduate career that someone said, well, if you don't like the sciences, why are you doing them? And somebody actually took the time to ask me what I liked. And I love stories. I like knowing about people and about where they've come from and about the impetus behind the choices they make. And I want to know about your family and how did they come to be here and those kinds of things. And that's not physiology. So I took, in grad school, I actually started taking history courses and I did oral history methodologies and narrative methodology, and started really developing a love for finding out how our people come to be where they are. How is it that when you talk to people of African descent in the Americas, we all have the same stories? We all have relatives who, you know, have lived in cities across North America, in England, in different Caribbean islands, and those things. So that love of diaspora that I have in terms of scholarship comes out of recognizing the sameness in much of the conversations that I have with people. The fact that my own family has been very nomadic in terms of their, you know, movement through the world. Like, you know, born in this country, was in this country by age 7, in this country by age 15, and so on and so forth. It's a very common tale in my own life. And then when I interview people, or when I spend time in the archives, the same stories emerge. So there's this kind of comfort and this kind of recognition that I've discovered in looking at other people's lives. And so this new phase of my life in terms of scholarship, my title, or the project that I'm working on, is Racial Justice and African Diaspora Migration. It encompasses everything that is me.
Yeah.
Right? It's my thirst for fairness and equity, also paired with my curiosities about movement. So I'll spend the next 5 years doing research into the things that give me joy.
Oh, that's wonderful. So. Doing what you love and getting paid for it, that's the way to go.
So I've heard.
Have there been mentors or outstanding people that you admire, whether in your personal life or just people that come to you through your research and your public life?
Whenever I ask that question, I smile because I have been so lucky. My life is so full in terms of the people who have inspired me, and in terms of the people who have supported me. So my number one fan, the person I look to more than anyone else in my life, is my mother, because she always told me there's nothing I couldn't do.
Wonderful.
Right? But the work I do, in terms of inspiration, in terms of mentors, the first person that comes to mind is Afua Cooper. And partially because going back to my undergraduate degree in physiology, when I was walking on the campus at U of T as a teenager, we used to see Afua Cooper, Dr. Afua Cooper, on campus walking around, and we'd all go, "That's Afua Cooper." And she was the most famous Black Canadian historian I knew. And I didn't know back then that there would be a time in my life where she would have been my master's supervisor. She would be a mentor I could reach out to whenever I needed to talk history or to talk about scholarship in any way. And so she's been a constant without even knowing it in my life. And another person is Senator Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard.
Yeah.
And Dr. Wanda, as people in Nova Scotia call her, is the reason I'm in Nova Scotia. She righted a wrong in terms of my opportunities to come here, and invited me to Nova Scotia to work on an oral history project with her.
Wow.
And has just created so many opportunities for me, and continues to be a champion in terms of racial justice, who's present. Right? She's not a champion who, like, you know, I love John Lewis, I love Angela Davis, but there are champions out there, you know, but a real life champion in front of me is Dr. Wanda. And she's been, you know, someone I can go to at any time for the last 2 decades. So I think those are the big ones.
And it's great to know that you're telling the Canadian stories.
Yes.
Because sometimes North America gets collapsed into American story, USA stories. Yes. So I'm really happy to hear about all of this work with the Black Battalion, the work at Acadia, and some of the names of the Canadian folks who are the champions for human rights and racial justice. But, I mean, this is the final question. You're an august scholar, very accomplished, and I know the students love you and are grateful that you have been here for 10 years to mentor them. But what do you do for fun?
Oh my goodness. Anything physical and anything outdoors. I have always been a nature lover. I actually, in 2018, a group of friends of mine and myself started a women's group in Halifax. And basically, it involves anything to do with the outdoors and challenging ourselves to do new things. Because one of the things I've come to discover is not everyone has had the opportunities I've had in terms of access to leisure activities. So I'll oftentimes talk about things that I've done or I do for fun, and people will say, "Oh, I've never tried that," or "That's not a Black thing."
Yeah.
And so one of the things we work to do is to open up spaces for especially Black women, but the group is for Black, Indigenous, and other racialized women. And we started out trying new things. So we've done trapeze yoga. We've gone paddling. We do paddle boarding. But then when COVID-19 started and we had all the restrictions on gathering, it became a hiking group. So we mostly hiked because you could go into the outdoors and just hike. So I do a lot of hiking. I've traveled to hike. I've gone to Europe to hike. I've gone to South America to hike. I like active vacations. So yeah, and I think for fun, anything physical.
Oh, Claudine, it has been wonderful. Thank you so much for making the time. Thank you for your work in listening to and sharing Canadian stories, African Canadian stories, for inspiring folks, and for keeping it moving.
Thank you.
To keep hiking and growing and setting that example for particularly younger Black women that, we can keep moving.
Yep.
Literally.
Yes, literally.
And figuratively. So thank you and all the best on this new chapter at Mount Allison.
Thank you so much.